All right, 3DMJers and other folks who are watching. This video is about the natural bodybuilding controversy. This is a video that I've struggled with even making because it has the potential to be such a negative thing. And for those who've been around in the sport a while or just aware of it, I didn't even become aware that there was such a thing as natural bodybuilding until I'd already been weight training and thinking about, reading Flex magazine and things like that for months, probably almost half a year. No, a year probably before I became aware of it. And it's something that has existed since the first time someone said, I'm drug-free, and once drugs had become vilified in our culture and seen as cheating in sport. And the first thing I want to say is, let's talk about why I'm even making this video at all, if it has such the potential to be negative. So to all you folks who are saying, Eric, why in God's name would you jump into this ridiculous discussion? I'm so tired of this conversation. All it's going to do is create hate, division, and dispute anger. Not this again. Let me say that that's the last thing I want to do. And I'm going to really try to do something beneficial with this video. Okay? So why am I making this video? Is to provide information to people who are open to learning. Meaning that if you've already come into this video and you've decided that most quote-unquote natural bodybuilders are just scumbag liars who are deluding the youth and just this massive collection of sociopaths and they're all on drugs, or if you think that everyone is natural who says they are in every organization and there's no cheating and that anyone who claims that is just a jealous hater, I would suggest that both of you guys, either one of those straw men I just put up, are probably wrong. The truth is typically in the middle, and this video honestly is not for you. If you are what I call a true believer, meaning that if I said, hey, what could I say to you that might change your mind on the subject, and you said, look, I know the truth, there's nothing that could change my mind, or if you gave me a scenario that was impossible so that you could hold on to your beliefs, this video is not for you. This video is strictly about providing information so that people who are open to learning and coming up with their own ideas instead of repeating what they hear from others can make informed decisions. I fully expect and hope that people who watch this video will come to different conclusions about natural bodybuilding. Okay? But my intent, because so much of this argument I see based on non-logical claims, misinformation, or poor science, or the misinterpretation or misunderstanding of science, is to help the discussion at least get more intellectual. Because why even have it if it's just going to be nonsense, right? Okay, so additionally to that, I want to have something also a little more concrete for the base of our followers, is to help people who want to bodybuild without using drugs, so you can make an informed decision about where you want to compete, and what kind of realistic expectations you should have about your physique development. So really, I am not here to change the minds of true believers. And I'm actually going to disable the comments on this because the people who are going to be true believers will get into an argument about this, and on both sides it's just going to be unhelpful debate. So you can feel free to take it to the forums or somewhere else, but it just won't be in this video. What I am going to have is a lot of information and supplementary resources and citations of what I'm talking about in the information section that I encourage everyone to read, to fact check me, to make sure that my interpretation and my presentation of this data is accurate. Okay? So first thing I want to state up front, because you can't take anyone's word if you don't know their biases, right? Is what the hell are my biases? So first off, right off the bat, I have a love of the sport of natural bodybuilding due to my experience. And my experience was one of, through the experience of contest prep and dieting myself down to extremely lean levels and overcoming obstacles that I never thought I could, and pushing myself past my comfort zone and really showing myself that, hey man, you don't have to be insecure, you don't have to not believe in yourself. Honestly, if you put your mind to it, you can overcome things you never thought possible. And this, I would not be getting my PhD, I would not have gotten my master's degree or my other master's degree, or have become a coach, or have married my wife, or really have been successful in the way that I am today and as happy as I am today well, not today, because I'm actually kind of saddened about this whole conversation, but in general, I would not have the kind of success that I have and reach the goals I'd set out if it wasn't for my experience in natural bodybuilding. So I have an idealistic and positive frame of mind about the sport of natural bodybuilding, which means that I want to share it with others and help others to have the same positive experience. I want to help those who aren't having a positive experience. And I want to make the sport even more positive. So things like cheating and drug use in natural bodybuilding are important to me for that reason. Another thing I learned is that through competition, it became much more or less about myself the more I did it. I let go of insecurity, and insecurity means you focus on yourself, which means you become more self-absorbed. And the more I met other people and they shared their journeys with me and their dedication, desire, discipline, and just the experiences, the more I grew through altruism, meaning helping others, connecting with others, finding the community atmosphere, and it really inspired me to become a coach and to dedicate my life to helping others reach their goals. And I don't mean just getting six-pack abs. I mean being happy and being self-actualized, meaning that whatever your goals are, helping you realize that you can accomplish them. So I exist in my life to educate and inspire others. Okay? So that's my bias, is that I'm going to come from a positive frame of mind, and I'm going to want to help other people succeed. And I also want to learn. I'm a lifelong learner, so that means that I want to be unbiased and objective as possible so that I can learn and grow. That means I try to keep an open mind. So that means I spend a lot of time considering, is it possible that the worst critics of the sport are correct? Could the vast majority of natural bodybuilders be on drugs? And that was something I had to seriously consider in order for me to approach this objectively and collect all the data. And I want to challenge everyone who's watching that if you can't ask yourself that question, and the flip of it, like if you believe the vast majority of people are on drugs, or if you believe the vast majority are honest, I want you to try to put yourself in the opposite position's shoes, critically examine that, because there are people who believe both. And that means that while facts can be incorrect or correct, experiences cannot. So some set of experiences has led people to believe two different things. Now, truth is truth, but we see that truth through the lens of our own experience, which means that we each have to take the data we have and our objective critical thinking ability and what feels right and make a decision. And I'm not here to make the decision for you. I'm here to present information. Okay. So I kind of turned that bias limitation into like a positive, like that. So anyway, so what is natural? First off, that's a subjective term. Your definition of natural might be different than mine. That might mean that you've never eaten growth hormone-injected beef, and that no one in America, unless they're a lifetime vegetarian, is natural. It might mean you've never used creatine or any supplements for some reason. That's fine. It may mean that currently you're not using steroids. That's your definition. And I'm not here to change your definition of what that is. You're free to have your definition. And I would never argue with you about what your definition is. Some people think I'm natural. Some people think I'm not, because back in 05 and 06, I experimented with pro hormones before I competed. The definition that I'm concerned with, and that we're going to talk about, is what is natural in competitive natural bodybuilding. And we're going to have a whole discussion about that based on each different organization. And really what we want to be talking about is, are the competitors and are natural bodybuilders who are competing following the rules set forth by their organization? And in that case, would they be natural by those organizations' standards? So some people would say, yeah, he's natural because Eric Helms competes under the guidelines of the organizations he competes in. Others would say, no, once he crossed that line and used a hormone, whether it was legal, not banned, over the counter, or for a short period of time, that does not matter. He's now not natural. And others would say, sure, he's natural now, but he's not lifetime natural, whatever. And you can make that distinction for yourself, about yourself, and about others. And you can share that with me. I won't argue. I'll just say that's nice. And if you want to know my definition, you can ask me. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. That's personal opinion. What we're going to talk about is competitive bodybuilding. And I want to kick it off with a great quote by Dave Palumbo. Those who don't know who Dave Palumbo is, he is a pretty popular figure in the sport of bodybuilding. He writes for Muscular Development, or did. I haven't followed the magazine for a while, but I think he's the owner of RX Muscle. I'm probably saying some wrong things because I've been out of that side of the sport for a few years. But Dave Palumbo, pretty well-known guy, very open about his drug use and others, or at least that's what I believe. And anytime I make a statement about somebody, it is my personal opinion, okay? And I'll be happy to redact it. If it's not the case, just contact me, all right? So from what I understand, Dave Palumbo competed at NPC Nationals, pretty open about what he did with his body, never competed as a natural competitor, and openly talks about how to use drugs, drug use, and from my understanding, his own drug use, okay? Also covers bodybuilding shows. And at the Team Universe, he had this statement while they were interviewing, while the two commentators were talking. This is a drug-tested show, not a natural show. So right there, we know that an insider who has been steeped in the culture of drug use is aware that there's a distinction between a drug-tested show and a natural show. And that's something we're going to talk about in great depth. Because many people have a conception about natural bodybuilding because their entire experience was around a certain organization. Like, I came up when the first time I found about natural bodybuilding was the INBF and WNBF. And that is it's almost its own little community. It had its own magazine. It was very tight-knit. They were very serious about drug testing and had a very kind of pro-natural, aggressive stance towards not using steroids. And others come from the background of never even have heard of that, and they've only heard of things like, Ronnie Coleman saying all natural, or Lance Armstrong getting caught for using drugs, and a background where there's this stigma that pretty much all athletes at a high level are using drugs, and don't know that there's different organizations and different standards of drug testing. So, in this example, the Team Universe, you can actually get an IFBB Pro card if you win this. And it is a amateur show where the urinalysis test some of the competitors. I believe the winners. I've never heard of anyone ever being caught. And like I said, these guys are competing to get a pro card to compete in the IFBB. So Dave Palumbo said, look, this isn't a natural show. This is a drug-tested show. And if he can make that distinction, coming from a very experienced, in-depth, engulfed in the drug-using community distinction, I think probably a logical person should be able to make that distinction as well if they have similar information and they know both sides of the story. So, drug testing. There's a lot of different kinds, and each organization has a different way of doing it. And we're going to get into that in depth. I'm going to pause it, move to the other whiteboard, and we'll continue. Okay, coming back around. So, I've got a lot of information here, and we're going to go through it step by step. So, organizations that are natural bodybuilding organizations, they're basically federations that have been around since, I want to say the late 80s is when a bunch of bodybuilding competitors said, hey, we don't want to use drugs, and we would like to have a level playing field, so let's create some organizations where we drug test. Because for those of you who don't know, the IFBB, like the Olympia and the most popular bodybuilding icons, like your Ronnie Coleman, your Jay Cutler, all those guys, your Phil Heath, and the IFBB, there isn't drug testing there. And I think it's pretty clear what's happening there. I don't think I need to spend a lot of time explaining that to you guys. But that isn't considered natural bodybuilding. Okay? But there are a lot of organizations that might call themselves drug-free, drug-tested, or natural. And let's go through them and how they determine that. Okay? So, we already talked about the Team Universe. Muscle Mania. It's a pretty big organization, and they have been considered a drug-tested show by some, natural by others. And I'm not going to tell you what I believe each one is. I'm just going to tell you how they all do their drug testing. Okay? There's the INBA, PNBA. There is the IFPA and its amateur affiliates, the OCB and the NANBF. So to be clear, there are amateur affiliates of pro organizations. So for example, Muscle Mania has pro and amateur divisions. The INBA is the amateur, and the PNBA is the pro of the Natural Bodybuilding Association. And then the International Physique or Fitness and Physique affiliation. I could be getting these acronyms wrong. Their affiliates are the OCB, the NANBF, and a few others, but those are the biggest ones. And then there is the WNBF, the World Natural Bodybuilding Federation, that's the pro division, and then the International Natural Bodybuilding Federation, that's the amateur division. There's also the DFAC and the NGA, and then we'll talk briefly about the Natural Athletes Alliance, which isn't exactly a federation, but it does some drug testing, so we'll discuss it. So, the type of testing that is used in these shows is almost always urinalysis and polygraph, which a lot of people don't even know about. And they all have different definitions of what is natural. Each one of these guys has their own banned list. A lot of them have now adopted the WADA list, the IOC, the Olympic Committee's list of what is considered natural or not, but many of them have their own, because some of that stuff doesn't really apply to bodybuilding. Let's go through each one. So we have the Team Universe. They supposedly urine test the winners, or some people randomly, or they have the right to, and they don't do any polygraphing. And from what I understand, there isn't necessarily a time drug-free that they require of the competitors. So basically, if you pass the polygraph, if you pass the urine test, you're good. So time drug-free would be at the time of testing. If you don't pop positive for any of the things on the urine test, you're good to go. Now that said, I have never heard of anyone failing the Team Universe test, at least not any of the winners, who you would think they would definitely urine test. And I've never heard anyone having their pro card revoked. I could be wrong, but that's just not something I've ever heard of. Okay? Muscle Mania is basically the same thing. Okay? INBA, PNBA, I've competed with them a long time, and it depends on the show. They actually have some lifetime natural shows. They have some shows that say you need to be 3 years drug-free, 5 years drug-free, or 7 years drug-free. I think that depends on the promoter's discretion on what they want to do. And they have a list that is basically the same as the IOCs, and they use WADA testing. Now, they rarely polygraph test people. I think Berto was polygraphed in 2007 when he won the INBA show. Every time I've done an INBA show, I've been urine tested. They urine test everyone, and from my understanding, they send in for the winners or anyone they suspect, because sometimes they'll come back and ask for a second urine test. So they have that A and B sample. So the reality is that if you get urine tested, it's pretty much, and you don't get polygraph tested, it pretty much only can verify for 100%, not even 100%, that it can only verify that you don't have the drugs that urine test can detect at the time of testing. Now, if they have polygraph and urine, that's a different story, and we're going to talk about that. Okay? So now, IFPA, OCB, NANBF, WNBF, INBF, DFAC, and NGA, these are, to my best recollection and what I could find online. If I'm slightly wrong, contact me, I'll redact it and change it. They will, at the amateur level, polygraph everyone and urine test the winners. Okay? And the year drug-free is 7 for most, and 5 for example, I think in the NGA, and I could be wrong, that may have changed. And they don't all have the exact same definition of drug-free. So for example, in 2009, I competed in what is now known as the Muscle Mayhem, and used to be called the Capital City. Back then it was an INBF show, and they had a legal over-the-counter pro-hormone period drug-free that was different from the rest of their 7-year thing. So they said, look, if you took over-the-counter stuff, as long as it's at least 2 years ago and this is your first time joining, you can compete. Because it wasn't illegal, it wasn't banned, they didn't see it on the same level as injectable steroids or full-blown illegal drugs, and it was really commonly used back in the early 2000 period. So that's what was their decision. They said, hey, if you use pro-hormones, there's a 2-year period. When they changed to the NANBF, which is an IFBA affiliate, they had different rules, and I couldn't compete in the show anymore because the NANBF had specifically banned the pro-hormone I used, a pro-steroid, back in January, and I had taken it months afterwards. So some of them will just kind of go by what the FDA and the IOC says, and others will have their own independent guys who are kind of watching the new supplements that come out and go, look, this is actually a steroid, ban it now, and they catch on at different times and make different lists. Okay, so there's not necessarily a universally agreed upon banned list. That's something they're all working on. But nonetheless, you've got pretty damn similar lists and 5 to 7 years drug-free. Okay? And now I can compete in all of them, just for my example. Anyway, so you're going to have people who are lifetime drug-free, people who used full-blown illegal steroids for 10 years and now been drug-free for 7 years, and guys who used pro-hormones and things like that a while ago, or maybe a couple of years ago, depending on the organization, all on the same show. And they will all may or may not necessarily qualify for different organizations, but hopefully, and that's what we're trying to determine, is are they abiding by the rules of the show they're competing in. Okay. So the most important thing is that you are aware, for those of you who want to compete, of the drug testing rules in each one of these. Now, for the pro divisions, like the IFPA and the WNBF and the pro divisions of the DFAC and the NGA, they urine test, I believe, everyone, and they polygraph everyone. Okay? So at the pro level, it costs more to enter shows, and it's because they have to afford for not only the prize money, but the cost of doing all the drug testing. So it is actually more expensive to compete in natural shows because you have to pay for your drug testing, which is hopefully cheaper than taking drugs. So there's some motivation for you. So different rules, and as you notice, I've kind of ordered these basically in different categories of how strictly they drug test. And we're going to get into the polygraph and the urine test specifically because there's a lot of critiques of both, rightly so. Okay. Next, let's talk about the Natural Athletes Alliance. We just made a recent video about this, and the big critique is, hey, these only test at the time of the show, so we need to be doing some kind of off-season testing. So these will, if you sign up, you can get randomly urine tested, and they have a 7-year WADA list, and they don't polygraph, but it can be at any time, and which is the biggest critique of the urine test is that it can happen, that drugs can clear out of your system, and it's only telling you, are you natural right now, not are you actually natural. So that's another organization that does drug testing. Now, the big question is so what happens? Do we have different bodybuilders as a result of these drug testing? I took 3 sample guys who I know are 5'9" and who have won the big shows that we're in discussion about here, and I added the IFBB Olympiads to kind of illustrate a point. So there has been an IFBB Olympia, Mr. Olympia, many-time winner, who has competed as heavy as 5'9" at 290 pounds, diced. Okay? There's also been Team Universe competitor at 5'9", 210 pounds, diced. Okay? Now remember, the Team Universe does some urine testing. IFBB Olympia, 0. Then we have the IFPA Jordan Cup, urinalysis, and polygraph. And I selected another guy who I know is 5'9", and his stage weight, shredded, diced, is 175 pounds. So there is certainly something happening here, and that there is a difference between what Dave Palumbo might categorize as, just bodybuilding, a drug-tested show, and perhaps a natural show. And these are like the world champions, okay? Now, let's take a brief moment to discuss normal sports versus bodybuilding, because I will acknowledge that there is rampant cheating in things like the Olympics and professional sport. And I think a big difference between normal sports and bodybuilding is that there's not a choice. And an athlete who wants to be at the top level in the NFL or in weightlifting or in rugby or these sports may very well at a certain point, whether they're correct or incorrect about this assumption, think that I need to use drugs if I want to be competitive at the top level. And if that is your life, if that is what you care about, you may make a decision to use drugs. Now, it's up to that person, whether that's the right or wrong decision, up to society about what to do about it. And I'm not here to state any kind of political or moral opinion on that. But the difference in bodybuilding is that there is a clear path. You can decide to compete in shows where there is no drug testing ever at all, and it is fully expected the higher level you get that you will be taking more drugs. Or you can compete in quote-unquote natural bodybuilding shows, which means that you will get drug tested, and at least the people who have created the organizations and run the shows want everyone to be natural. So, is there cheating? I would say anything you can cheat will be cheated. So there must be cheaters. Is everyone cheating? Well, that's not, like I said, I'm not going to make that decision for you. I'm just going to present all the information. All right. So moving on, let's go to some of the best estimates we can figure out of what is possible natural by some extremely intelligent people and some highly objective information. And then let's talk about the testing methods that we currently have. I'm going to pause it and we'll move the screen. Okay, so first things first, let's talk about how do we know what is possible to achieve naturally if there is so much debate about who is natural and who is not. And there's some really intelligent guys who've done some awesome work on this who are way smarter than me. And I'm going to invoke some names that some of you who read a lot of articles may have heard of, and those of you who just sit around on YouTube and watch a lot, I would highly recommend you actually read this stuff. Okay. First gentleman I'd like to say is Casey Butt, PhD in, I believe, mathematics, and he has a website called The Way Trainer. And basically what he did is he got all the measurements, verifiable measurements that he is sure of, from like the 30s to the, I believe, the late 40s and maybe into the early 50s of physiques before the steroid era. And sure, there's some critique that steroids did exist in the 40s. But you have to honestly ask yourself, would a cutting-edge drug that was being developed in laboratories and was completely new be available to an extremely small niche subculture that was probably 1% as large as it is now? And would they be able to get access to it and afford it? I think logically you can say people from the 30s and 40s most likely were not on steroids. So that is one thing. And he took those measurements and also the measurements, and that's kind of like his baseline data, and the measurements of a bunch of drug-tested natural competitor champions, found that they correlated. So that might be some evidence for some of you right there to decide that, oh, maybe some of the drug testing is okay, as the natural champions aren't exceeding what the guys did before steroids existed. And he created all of these different mathematical models based on height, gender, body fat percentage, and measurements of your wrist and ankle size and a bunch of other stuff. He has a great PDF book that's highly affordable that you can get there called Your Natural Muscular Potential. Now, a couple things before you check out his website. He has a disclaimer that I'm going to read because I think it's quite good. The world of popular bodybuilding has always been and probably always will be full of exaggerations, deceptions, and sometimes outright lies. Unfortunately, those exaggerations often shape people's perceptions of bodybuilders' legitimate measurements. The purpose of the information presented in this article is to provide accurate references and tools so people can form appropriate training expectations based on reality. That said, even many adults don't have the maturity and intelligence to accept and deal with knowledge of their own limitations. If you're comfortable with your current perception of your bodybuilding potential, depending on how realistic your training expectations are, and think that any threat to that perception might negatively influence your self-image or motivation to train, do not read this article. So the point being is he gets so much flack for defining in more quantitative terms what can be achieved without drugs. So this is actually a guy getting flack from natural competitors for saying how far they can get, which is pretty ironic when you consider people who are within those potentials are getting flack for being on drugs. So there's definitely some illogicalness going on either side of the equation. And it's good to know limitations so long as you have the right perspective. Knowing your genetics gives you a goal to shoot for, because in reality, getting to 100% of your genetic potential is going to take a lifetime. And it shouldn't depress you to know that you might be able to accomplish something like that, and that should be the whole goal. So I would say you should be comfortable knowing what your natural limit might be based on Casey's studies. And I'm not at mine yet. So I'm not like, I can compete probably 5 to 6 pounds heavier on stage according to his equations, which gives me great hope. And believe me, 5 or 6 pounds will probably take me 3 times that many years. Okay. Another fantastic article that's going to be in the notes is written by a guy named Lyle McDonald, who you may have heard. And Alan Aragon and Martin Birkin are mentioned in it because they've written similar articles based on the same information. And that's based on a study that talks about the fat-free mass index of steroid and non-steroid users. So it was this study, this survey done of a bunch of guys who lift weights and have training a long time, and some of them are on testosterone, cypionate, and some who are not, and what their anthropometrics are. And they saw what was the range of expectations, and thus what was the maximal expectation you could expect based on the sample size, and what you couldn't. And this is stuff that Casey used in his work as well. Now, some might critique it for saying, oh, the guys could have lied in this study, or the urinalysis didn't detect it. But you have to, at a certain point, take things at face value. Okay, so this is a peer-reviewed scientific article written by multiple doctors trying to assess something and getting people into their study who are openly admitting to using steroids or people who say they don't. And I would propose that if you completely disbelieve everyone who in the study that they lied about it, then that's a pretty paranoid view of the world. So that might have a bigger issue at hand. But in this article, they found that probably a fat-free mass index of 25 is about the maximum you can achieve naturally. And fat-free mass index is based on how much fat-free mass you're carrying at a certain height. Okay? Now, that is pretty much going to be valid if you're between the height of 5'6" to 6'2", where you start getting on kind of the outliers and your anthropometrics won't be 100% correct. And it's assuming you can accurately measure your body fat percentage, which is really, really difficult, and most of the time, unless you're doing it with a DEXA or a dunk tank, you're probably incorrect. And even then there's error. So there is definitely some wiggle room. Now, these have both received critiques. Some people are saying, look, the bodybuilders in the 40s were on drugs. It's possible. I think very unlikely, but it's possible. And the natural bodybuilders who were included were on drugs. I'd say, again, probably more possible than the guys in the 40s and 50s being on drugs, but probably unlikely. And then the other critique would be, look, the guys in the studies were lying, and they were on drugs. And I would say, again, probably highly unlikely, but possible. And interestingly enough, they all match up. So it really starts to stretch the limits of logic to think that in all of those cases, people were lying about their drug use. And then finally, I would present this recent article done in 2013, a case study, as almost irrefutable evidence that supports the concept that about a fat-free mass index of 25 and that level of size can be attained naturally. This is a 12-month case study of a IFBB pro, a new pro, during his contest preparation, who in that time period got 13 blood tests. That means that every month this guy was getting a blood test in a lab, and I'm going to give as much information as I feel comfortable about the subject of the case study, because I know who it was, but you're not supposed to disclose who's in case study, so it remains anonymous. But this is an IFBB pro, okay? So that means somebody who is abiding by the IFBB pro rules, someone who's been multiple times drug tested, both urinalysis and polygraph, and who is now receiving 13 blood tests at a high-level American university, and a bunch of other... Sorry, camera died. So I was saying about this case study. So the whole purpose of it was to get what happens to somebody when they go through a 12-month, 6-month basically dieting down phase into a natural bodybuilding show, and 6 months recovery. And they were measuring testosterone, a whole hormonal panel, testosterone, and ghrelin, leptin, a bunch of other markers. You'll have the link to it in the notes, and you can find the full text online. So this person was being examined under lab conditions and had 13 testing sessions in a 12-month period. So pretty damn, and they got tested at their show specifically for drug use over a 7-year period. So you can be pretty damn sure this person was natural. I would say I'm 99% confident that this is a case study of someone who does not use drugs or has not used drugs, or at the very least was not using drugs for this 12-month period. And guess what? At the time of competition, when they got to their damn leanest, like 4.5% body fat, measured by, I believe, DEXA, the fat-free mass index of this person was 24.9. So that gives some pretty damn good validity to that 25 fat-free mass index figure as being about as big as you can get without taking drugs. Okay? So yeah, I would say this is probably even more rock solid than there, and it confirms what we've seen there. So all that together, you can make some decisions when you look at someone's stats. Now, granted, how well you do in bodybuilding is not determined by your stats. I mean, small guys win sometimes because they have great attachments or broad skeletal frames. Just the distance between one clavicle and the other, and the width of your rib cage probably matters a lot more than how much muscle mass you have, to be honest. I'll make another video about that sometime. Anyway, yeah, it's kind of funny. If you have a big rib cage, you're going to get more steroid accusations than if you don't, no matter how much muscle you're carrying. Anyway, okay, so this person did pretty well, middle of the pack at a pro show. So a competitive, natural bodybuilder, and that's how big they are. So this is a pretty damn verifiable case study about what's realistic as a natural lifter. Now, let's talk about some of this testing that we were talking about before. The big one that gets critiqued a lot is the urinalysis, and rightly so. Since they started doing drug testing at like the Olympics and for pro sports, there's been labs that help athletes who want to cheat the drug test, or sometimes athletes that don't. Like if you look back in corrupt nations back in like the 80s, like the USSR or some of the Eastern Bloc or Asian countries, there were stories that probably could be verified if you looked it up of having institutionalized cheating. So in the more corrupt countries, there's actually the government-funded cheating going on where they have labs for trying to beat the labs that are developing the urine tests. So there's this kind of constant way of just trying to beat the current technology on both the sides of the dopers and the drug users, and so the drug testers, excuse me. Okay, camera is nearly dead, but we're going to keep going. So real quick, so depending on the current chemistry going on, you may or may not be able to beat the test. But the biggest thing that's going to dictate whether you can beat the test is how long drugs have been in your system, right? So urinalysis test just tells you what's in your urine right now. And a savvy person who wants to use drugs could easily just take drugs that don't stay in their system. So the natural bodybuilding community responded to this by starting to institute polygraph testing, lie detector testing, like you might see on Maury Povich. Or the Department of Defense and the U.S. government uses to decide whether or not its employees can keep their security clearances. I have some personal experience with this. When I was in the Air Force, I was in intelligence, kind of doing analysis, stuff like that. And to get my security clearance, I had to go through a background check, which included a polygraph. And then to keep my security clearance every year, I had to take a polygraph. So it's not admissible in court because, reasonable doubt. But an employer or a natural bodybuilding organization, especially the U.S. government as an employer, can decide, look, you can't get on our stage, or they can, tell you can't have your security clearance if you can't pass this test. Okay. And you'll hear everyone say, oh, it's not reliable, it's crap. But I said, I need to actually look up how reliable is the polygraph. And what I thought was probably the best look at this was a meta-analysis, which is taking a bunch of studies that look at the same thing and pooling all the results together. So there was a meta-analysis done in the late 80s when they were really looking at the polygraph a lot that found that the accuracy, depending on the study, was anywhere between 50 to 100%. So meaning chance of being right or wrong to 100% accurate in that small population group. Now they took the mean of that, with the average, and they found that when trying to assess guilt, which is what we do in natural bodybuilding, we don't try to test if you're natural, we try to test if you use drugs, which is more accurate, as you can see. They found that 74% of the time, they would correctly identify the person who was lying. They would be incorrect 8% of the time, and they'd be inconclusive 18% of the time. And a really interesting part of this study was they tried to assess why is there so much variance? Why does it range from 50 to 100%? And they found that 2/3 of the explanation statistically for that variance had to do with three things. One, was there an incentive? Meaning, in one study, for example, they would pay you $50 if you could beat the polygraph test. And that actually improved the accuracy. Because in a lab, if I just tell you, hey, lie about your dog, tell me you don't have a dog even though you do, you don't have any emotional attachment to that. You won't have a physiological response, which is actually what the polygraph measures. Not if you're lying, but do you have the physiological response that we associate with lies. So when you know you're lying and there's an incentive to lie, like someone trying to beat a drug test, it gets it more accurate. The second thing they found is based on the sample. So is the sample size big enough? Is it representative of the population we're looking at? And typically, the studies here are smaller than the sample size you'll see in a large drug-tested show. So you'd think probably better in real life than in the lab on that account as well. And then finally, a big one which influenced that variance, to get more accurate, the more they used realistic field methods of assessing, of making a decision on whether it's correct, incorrect, or a question mark. Meaning instead of just going, look, he had this many marks that equals fail, 10 is greater than 9, quantitative, they would say, okay, we'll have the experienced polygrapher make a decision based on the data and interpret it. And that increased it a lot. And I can tell you, having taken polygraphs for the US government and for multiple bodybuilding organizations, they are not all created equal. I've taken a 5-minute polygraph to step on the stage, and I've taken a 1-hour polygraph where I got tested 3 times in a row because I knew the guy was trying to go, look, I don't want to be uncertain. I don't want to give a false positive. I want to know for sure if this guy is telling the truth. And at the same show, I'm not going to disclose which one because it's, that's the promoter's choice, but the promoter told me that almost every year a handful of people don't get to get on stage. So people do get caught. And even with urinalysis, people do get caught. Okay? Now you can analyze that piece of data as you want. Does that mean that there's a lot of people cheating and we catch some? Or does that mean that drug testing works? Or that drug testing doesn't work? Or that just means whatever? But I would say the best thing we can do these days, which is what matters, if you actually care about having drug-free sport, is polygraph, urinalysis, test everyone, and test in the off-season. Because the majority of the time, the athletes, even at the Olympic and pro level, who should know how to beat these tests, get caught from off-season urinalysis testing. Or off-season testing in general. So that's probably the best way to do it. And if you ever want to analyze a physique or a person and decide whether you think they're natural, which would be your opinion, it wouldn't be fact, assess those things. Do they meet what we know is naturally possible? Then look at their history. How many times have they competed and in what organizations, so you know what drug tests they were subjected to. So for example, this IFBB Yorton Cup winner who I'm talking about is 5'9", 175, and shredded, would be within the range of what is reasonable to accomplish naturally. And finally, we know that they've been competing since the early 2000s and competing almost every year. So let's say that's 7 years of competing, at least, and competing in 2 to 3 shows per year. And they get tested at every show. So that's over 20 urinalysis and polygraph tests that this person has been subjected to in the last 10 years. And they passed all of them. So that would be how I'd make my decision on whether I thought someone was natural. But of course, it would still be speculation until they've been proven beyond any kind of logical doubt to be on drugs. And I would suggest that if you're someone who likes to use logic and science and evidence to make decisions, that might be a good way to make your decisions as well. And finally, I'd like to just put this a little emotional piece out there that for people who care about natural bodybuilding, like myself, and who, the personal choice of their own was to not use drugs, and when you tell them they're on drugs, or accuse them of it, or call them a liar or a cheater, you may think, what's the big deal? I'm just saying you're big. But for someone who actually competes in drug-tested shows, that is really not a question of just, are you a good physique or not? It's a question of their integrity, because you're saying, hey, you walk around living a lie, and you're a sociopath, because you can beat polygraphs, lie, live this life, and not be bothered by it. Because I couldn't imagine looking myself in the mirror if I was just living this complete lie. So I would also question, really think about that before you accuse somebody. Like, I'm not just saying this guy's got a drug-worthy physique. I'm saying, I think you're a sociopath. I think you are someone of no integrity. And I personally only make choices about someone's integrity when I know them. Well, I don't make judgments about Mariah Carey. I don't make judgments about the president. I don't make judgments about people I see on YouTube until I actually know who they are, And of course, there's outliers. Like I probably have judgments against Hitler, But in the normal kind of range of people you might meet on the street, it's probably good to reserve judgment until you actually know the person. So, all things to consider, and I hope this was valuable. And mostly, I hope this was useful for the folks who are considering being natural and want to know what's possible and where they should compete. And at the very least, it'll serve that purpose. And please check out all the resources here. Thank you guys for your time, and hopefully this debate can become less hateful and less damaging, because I think there's a lot of people who are really caused hurt by this. I mean, just emotional pain. So I'm empathetic to people on both sides of the fence who are getting, people are actually trying to make them feel worse online or in person. That's kind of a shitty thing when you think about it. All right, guys, thanks for your time.